Netanyahu have a plan for Gaza after the war? Netanyahu's biographer Anshell Pfeffer writes a cover piece this week that Bibi's strategy is more about maintaining the status quo rather than a plan for peace. So is Netanyahu simply focused on his own political survival? Joining me to discuss is journalist Jonathan Spire and Spectator contributor Paul Wood. Jonathan and Paul, welcome to Spectator TV. Now, Jonathan, to start with, can you tell us about Netanyahu's day after Hamas plan and what do you make of it?
Yes, well, my sense of the plan, at least, is it's basically a reiteration of known and existing Israeli positions since the beginning of the war. So such examples as continuing the fight until Hamas and Islamic Jihad military capability and Hamas governance is destroyed, the establishment of a buffer zone, the notion of an indefinite or open-ended Israeli security presence in the Gaza Strip were all known, and this is a kind of codification of them. At the same time, I think that there's a couple of notable absences which I think point to the presence of political considerations on Netanyahu's part, specifically, of course, the issue of preserving his cabinet intact. One is that the statement does not either endorse or overtly reject any presence of the Palestinian Authority in post-war arrangements in Gaza. And the second is, of course, the statement does not either endorse or overtly reject the issue of Jewish resettlement in Gaza. So these are kind of winks, in a way, one to the centrist elements in his cabinet, Gantz and Eisenkot regarding the PLO, one to the far-right presence in his cabinet, Ben-Gvir and Smotrich. So I think those would be my immediate thoughts regarding the plan.
Paul, I'm keen to get your thoughts as well as what you think about the realistic practicalities of some of these points, such as a permanent disarmament of Gaza. Is that even possible?
Well, permanent disarmament of Gaza is just restating the war aim of utterly destroying and disarming all the armed groups in Gaza. It's a recipe for permanent war, which is another way of saying a recipe for keeping Mr. Netanyahu permanently in office, because as soon as the war stops, when they have elections, he's vastly unpopular in Israel. He'll be on his way out. It's true that the Palestinian Authority isn't explicitly mentioned, but it is implicitly dismissed in this idea of local, I think the phrase is managerially competent local people to manage Gaza somehow. The Hamas stronghold for the past 16 years, they're just going to melt away. And some worthy citizens, Lord knows where they'll find these worthy citizens, and people brave enough to do it will somehow emerge and start running things, and do it when there's no longer UNRWA. What's to replace UNRWA isn't mentioned. This can also be interpreted not only as addressed to Mr. Netanyahu's own cabinet, but to the Americans. The Americans want the Palestinian Authority back in. They want a temporary ceasefire now, and they want a permanent ceasefire later. And more than that, there is a very ambitious play going on here. Martin Indyk, a former US ambassador to Israel, said the Biden administration is trying to get Mr. Netanyahu to swallow a frog. The frog being the idea of a Palestinian state, something he's fought against his entire political life. Either he swallows the frog and there is a Palestinian state and a permanent peace involving all the Arab states led by Saudi Arabia, and it's an amazing achievement for the Biden administration, or he chokes on the frog, spits it up, breaks his coalition, and something else comes into play.
And Jonathan, how much is this plan about? I hear what you are both saying about how none of it is particularly new, but how much of it is actually intended to work, and how much of it is actually just about Netanyahu keeping his cabinet together, keeping himself in power? Does he even want it or know it's going to work?
There is a view which says that Netanyahu is deliberately sort of shaping his policy towards the war with regard to himself staying in power. Of course, none of us can sort of be in Netanyahu's mind, and therefore that inevitably is speculation. What I would say from the point of view of this situation, as I see it at least, is that if that is what Netanyahu is doing, it's not going to work, because it seems clear, I think, to almost everybody here that October 7th will be the epitaph of Netanyahu's political career. Once there are already growing calls here in Israel, sitting here in Jerusalem, for elections. If and when the intensity of the combat begins to wind down, and it's already winding down considerably from a time when there was 4 divisions to 5 divisions at one time inside Gaza. then you'll find it won't be, Netanyahu will find, if this is what he's trying to do, that it won't be possible for him to resist the calls for election. So if indeed that is what Netanyahu is trying to do, it's a strange move, and it won't work. In terms of whether it's workable, whether the ideas themselves are workable or not, it's one can argue this way or that. Certainly from the Israeli public's point of view, anything which involves the continuance of Hamas governance inside the Gaza Strip will be regarded as a defeat for Israel, and that will be something which the public will punish any policymaker from centre or right or left who's associated with that. I think it's important to note also with regard to Martin Indyk, who was mentioned a moment ago, again, the notion that Palestinian statehood, a Palestinian partner on the other side for Israel, and workable arrangements acceptable to both sides, bringing about a two-state solution, remains just as much in question now, I would remind us, as it did before October 7th. So the idea that there's either this plan or an immediate rush towards conflict solution should, I think, perhaps be worthy of some caution.
And Jonathan, just on that, because you are in Jerusalem at the moment, what is the mood like there? Because after October 7th, there was clearly a lot of pain, shock, and probably, well, you would tell me better than I would know, but maybe vengefulness as well. Do people feel fatigued at this idea of a stalemate in the war?
I don't think there's exactly a feeling of fatigue. I think the issue of the hostages with regard to public sort of consciousness and concerns is very much front and center. I do think that, if you look at also at the mainstream TV channels and much of the sort of public discussion, the hostages and their fate are very much front and center. The other thing to be borne in mind in terms of public perceptions right now, and this is also just in terms of recent days, is that there's increasing concern regarding the north. That is to say, the Israel-Lebanon border and the prospects of very sharp escalation between Israel and Hezbollah in Lebanon in the days ahead. Just in recent days, we saw Israel, hitting the furthest it had hit into Lebanon, actually since the 2006 war, striking a target in Baalbek, fully 75 kilometers from Israel's border, and then Hezbollah hitting back, targeting a military center in Mount Meron. So there is a sense that a very possible escalation in the north. So those two issues, I think, hostages and escalation in the north, are very much front and center in terms of public discussion at the present time. And the fighting in Gaza, because the intensity of the fighting and therefore the Israeli losses in Gaza, and also the intensity of Hamas rocket fire on Israeli targets, depleting as Hamas's military capacity depletes inside Gaza, have all been sort of down in recent weeks actually now. And that to some degree has therefore lessened the focus on events inside the Gaza Strip in terms of Israeli public discussion.
Paul, what's your read on the situation on the border with Lebanon? Do you think that escalation is likely or possible?
I don't think likely, because Hezbollah appears not to want to escalate. Sheikh Nasrallah, the leader of Hezbollah, gave a very measured and balanced speech about 6 weeks ago in which he clearly was not frothing at the mouth for war. He takes his orders from Tehran, so it appears that Iran, while wanting to keep the pressure up on Israel, doesn't want a wider war. Of course, there is always room for miscalculation. Let's not forget how a very minor clash on the border in 2006 spiraled into a full-scale war, 38-day war, very quickly. This time around, according to Israeli estimates anyway, Hezbollah has 150,000 plus medium-range or long-range accurate rockets, long-range mortars, things that can hit Tel Aviv. And as the Israelis always say, Israel can only lose one war. So I don't think it's likely. Nevertheless, it shouldn't be discounted. I think far more likely is something that Britain and the United States learned to their cost in both Iraq and Afghanistan, which is that you can win, you can triumph militarily, you can lose politically. And you're seeing a steady erosion of international support for Israel. 1.5% of Palestinians in Gaza, 30,000 people have been killed. How many are fighters? How many civilians? I don't know, but certainly looks very bad for Israel. One British politician called it a killing frenzy. So if Israel's international legitimacy is eroded, if some kind of political deal is forced on an Israeli government, all of these are ways that Israel can lose in the end, despite all the moral capital they acquired on October the 7th. That is being drained away with every civilian life that is lost in Gaza.
Yeah, absolutely. And Jonathan, I want to come back to you on the exit strategy in just a bit. But Paul, seeing as you've mentioned Iran, and Iran is also going to the polls this week, could that election change anything at all? What do elections really mean in that country?
There are elections of a kind, but critics of the regime in Iran say that they're rigged. There has been a brutally suppressed and so far unsuccessful street protest, which has been continuing on and off the past 18 months. Iran always seems to be on the point of change, but nothing ever seems to happen. The people who call the shots, the senior religious figures in Iran, they're not changing. I don't suppose the policy will change either. But there's always the unexpected, the strategic shock. It's a region which is a tinderbox. Everybody's making these calculations. These calculations can be blown apart with one wrong move by any party. And let's not forget that Israel has nuclear weapons, which in the final analysis, who knows under what conditions they might be used. Iran is getting closer to one of those bombs. Hezbollah can rain down death from the skies over the border with Lebanon. Nobody could be complacent about what happens, elections or no elections.
Yeah. And Jonathan, finally then, what is the way that Israel should be looking at in terms of its exit strategy? You know, Netanyahu and his political interests aside, as an analyst, what do you think is the way out of this?
Well, in a way, I think it would go back to what we were focusing on, or you were focusing on a moment ago. In my view, is that the Hamas authority in Gaza needs to be seen within the broader context, which is one in which Islamic Republic of Iran has succeeded in the last decades, really, over the last 2 decades, in seeding Islamist semi-regular armies on 2 of Israel's borders, let's say in Gaza and in Lebanon, and to a degree also in Syria, with freedom of movement thence all the way back through Iraq to Iran itself. Now, this is the strategic level. And on this level, Iran is doing very well indeed. Whatever tactical gains Israel makes in terms of its military activities against Hamas in Gaza, or indeed against Hezbollah in Lebanon. And my own view is that I would like to see a little bit more of that strategic level being taken into account. That, to my view, is a situation in which Israel cannot and should not acquiesce to. The notion is that Israel is to be subjected to a kind of death by 1,000 cuts, partly through the presence of those semi-regular armies. And my view is that Israel should be thinking about ways in which it can lessen or indeed remove the presence of those long-range assets available to Iran on Israel's borders, which are being used to make life in Israel as impossible as the Iranians can manage to make it.
Paul?
Well, yeah, it's long been thought that Iran's strategy here is to keep Israel tied up on the northern border with Hezbollah, on the southern border with Hamas. And that's why a lot of people thought that the ultimate author of the October 7th attacks was to be found in Tehran, not in Gaza. Hamas has repudiated that idea. It wants to claim credit or responsibility for everything that happened on October the 7th. It really depends on the United States, ultimately. It's quite interesting to me, the increasing public signaling from the United States that it wants the fighting in Gaza to stop. I don't know how seriously we should take that. If they really wanted the fighting to stop, they could stop sending bombs to Israel. Presumably President Biden could pick up the phone and in one call cause Israeli forces to push back. The United States knows that ultimately it's going to have to carry the can for anything that happens between Israel and Iran. And therefore, presumably, it is allowing the offensive from Gaza to go on for as long as it has, with the aim of, as Jonathan said, taking one of these tools out of the hands of the Iranian mullahs, that tool being Hamas.
Paul and Jonathan, thank you so much for joining Spectator TV.